Welcome back to Intro to Religion 1030. We're going over Tim Bayne's book, Philosophy of Religion, a very short introduction. In this video, we're going over Exam 1, Part A, Question 1, which is, do you agree or disagree with Bayne's criticism of perfect being theology? Why? Okay, so on page 8, Tim Bayne brings up the concept of natural theology. So natural theology, he describes as, this approach is known as natural theology, natural because it appeals to our natural capacities for reasoning, that we can use our human reason to understand God. So he goes on to say, one of the most influential traditions within natural theology begins with the idea that God must be perfect in every respect, for an imperfect being would not be worthy of our worship in the way in which God is and must be. Okay, so what does it mean to be a perfect being? Is that even intelligible? So that is the question. I'm going to go back and look at this. What are the criticisms of perfect being theology? So he mentions that most often people associate God's perfection with omnipotence, total power. To be perfect, you have to have infinite power, as well as infinite knowledge. But then he'll question, how do we know that? Are those really good criteria for a perfect being? Can you even define what a perfect being is? So on page 9, he says, most fundamentally, it is unclear whether the notion of a supremely perfect being is coherent. So he says some things it's easy to understand are perfect. A perfect circle, a perfectly smooth surface. You can conceive of what those mean. Even if you never find one in nature, you know what you would have to have in order to find a perfect circle. But then he goes on to say, but there are other concepts for which talk of a perfect X is of dubious intelligibility. What would it take to be a perfect book, a perfect vegetable, a perfect jazz solo? So if you couldn't define a perfect jazz solo or a perfect musical band, a lot of people have debates about who's the best rock and roll band of all time, and people have various answers, and a lot of times people say, well, it's completely subjective. There are no objective criteria by which you could definitively decide who's the best rock and roll band around. Some people might say Led Zeppelin, some people might say the Grateful Dead. I mentioned those two examples because I was having this debate earlier, and somebody brought up a joke about a t-shirt they saw. It's impossible to decide what is the best music. It's entirely subjective. Everyone has their own tastes. And even the attempt to do this is coercive. At the end, it said the Grateful Dead. So that was just the kind of this is an ongoing debate. So is there a criteria by which we could define a perfect being? And that's what we're going to get into. So he says on page 10, regarding the idea of God's having absolute power and knowledge. So he says, okay, would that really are those really good criteria for a maximally perfect being with all of the good-making properties? And Tim Bayne says, they certainly strike me as unsatisfactory. For one thing, the idea that the excellence of a being depends on the degree to which it is powerful or knowledgeable seems odd. After all, we don't typically regard the excellence of human beings as dependent on their power or knowledge. Okay, I already disagree with him there, but he'll go on to say, I know more than my 6-year-old nephew does, and I can certainly do more than he can, but surely that does not make me more excellent than he is. I'd say it does. That's why they pay, Tim Bayne to write this book, and his 6-year-old nephew, who's 7 now, because this was, or I guess 8 now, this was printed in 2018, is less excellent. His nephew is potentially excellent, but Tim Bayne has developed virtues through study and time that give him more power and knowledge than his nephew. So I don't see why he finds it complicated to consider someone with a powerful mind that's well trained to be more excellent than someone with a less powerful mind that's less trained, at least in respect of intellectual ability. You might say, well, yeah, maybe the nephew, the 6-year-old boy, is just as excellent as anyone else in terms of just being a fundamental human being. But at any rate, these are the kinds of questions that you need to address if you're going to answer this question for exam 1. So he goes on to say at the bottom of page 10, perfect being theology provides a useful guide to God's nature only if we have the capacity to discern whether having a certain property contributes to a being's excellence, and it is far from clear that we do. Consider the property of simplicity. Some perfect being theologians argue that God must be simple on the grounds that simplicity is a good-making property. But why suppose that simple beings are objectively more excellent than complex ones, rather than vice versa? Perfect being theology presupposes, all right, so do we have an adequate reason to believe that we have the standards by which to judge a perfect being? I think that's a good question. I think it's a powerful question. On the other hand, I think knowledge and power are good-making qualities that any perfect being would have to have. Regarding this idea of simplicity, what does he mean by simple versus complex? Well, philosophically, simple means not compounded of parts. And God was assumed to be simple because anything that's compounded of parts can be decomposed. If you build it, you can destroy it. So God, therefore, to be perfect would be indestructible and therefore simple, not compounded. So at this point, I'll bring up something that's not directly mentioned in the book, although the Big Bang is mentioned in this book, and quantum mechanics and general relativity. They're all mentioned in this book. The details aren't given, and I don't expect anyone in this class to know the details of those, although I do present the optional YouTube videos describing these steps in 20th century physics: special relativity, general relativity, quantum mechanics, and then string theory. But I think it's just worthwhile to consider this, the idea of the gravitational singularity, which is the source of the cosmos, according to the Big Bang theory, which is based on general relativity, says that the entire universe, the past, the present, and the future of all space and time, originated in and was compacted in a single point, a simple point of infinite density, known as a gravitational singularity. It has all of the primary qualities of the omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent God of the monotheistic religions. It's infinitely powerful because it's infinitely dense. It contains all of the energy that could ever possibly exist, an infinite amount of energy in zero volume, no extension in space, yet infinitely powerful. It's omniscient, or has all knowledge, in the sense that it contains all of the information that will describe the entire cosmos. It's omnipresent for more complex reasons, but in one sense it's omnipresent because it contains all space and time. And it's simple. It's not compounded of parts. It cannot be divided. So Tim Bayne mentioned Blaise Pascal, I believe it was a 17th century Catholic mathematician and theologian. He asked, is it impossible for God to be omnipresent and yet indivisible? And it would seem that that is impossible. Anything spread throughout all space can be divided. So Pascal says, I'll show you how that's possible. A point traveling everywhere infinitely fast. It would be at every point an infinitely accumulating number of times simultaneously. It wouldn't take any time for it to travel from here to here to here. It would be at all points simultaneously, an infinite number of times simultaneously, and yet it would remain indivisible, a single point, just adding the element of infinite speed. So just giving a flavor of how this philosophy of religion has been played out, and these are the basic questions, and this is a very short introduction. So I'm just providing an introductory platform for how to answer these kinds of questions. So those are some of the issues that Tim Bayne brought up. So again, this video has covered the Part A, number 1 question for Exam 1. Do you agree or disagree with Bayne's criticism of perfect being theology?